Hello friends, I'd like to share a beautiful Rebbe story with all of you. Many of my friends and family know the story, but those of you who don't, I think you'll find it very, very inspiring. Many years ago, my parents had immigrated to the United States from Paris, France. My grandparents remained in Paris because the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe had told my grandparents that they have to stay in Paris because he needed them to do special holy work for him in Paris. Now, about 20 years on, my mother, living in the United States now, got a phone call, which she was very, very upset, but she got a phone call to say that my grandfather had had a stroke and he was in the hospital. My grandmother couldn't cope. She was not a coper. She couldn't cope. Cut a long story short, my mother got on a plane. She went to Paris, and lo and behold, yes, my Zayda was in the hospital, and my grandmother was besides herself. So my mother went to speak to the doctors. It was very difficult. Everything was French. My mother didn't speak French. She spoke Yiddish and English, and slowly but surely, she understood that my Zayda would be in the hospital for a prolonged period of time. Now, it was coming close to Sukkos, and my mother knew that there was not a chance that my Zayda would eat in the hospital room without having a sukkah. So she measured the outside. He was very, very fortunate that he had a little patio outside of his room, and my mother measured the space exactly. She went off to a hardware shop and bought 4x4s, pieces of wood, plywood, and a hammer and some nails. And then she came back to the hospital. She erected the structure, and she had a tiny little structure, but it was enough to fit a table and chairs. She went back to Hotel de Ville, to this hardware shop, and she bought bright yellow sheets of plastic, which she draped all around the structure so that it shone like the sun was coming in. Even at night, she hung one bulb from the structure of the sukkah, and even at night, the sukkah looked like it was sunlit. It was very important for my Zayda to have a happy demeanor and not to be sad that he was in the hospital over this very auspicious time. Then my mother, she went to the hospital kitchen. She borrowed a big knife. She stood on a chair. She cut down some branches from a tree, and she put it on top of her sukkah. And it was a beautiful sukkah. And my grandfather couldn't believe it. How did his daughter do such a thing in Paris? Who gave her permission? How did she manage to climb up and put the cut the schach, and then put it on top of the sukkah? And he was able to sit there and make a bracha on the lulav and the esrog and eat his little meal in the sukkah. It took 4 months, much to my chagrin, for my mother to come home back to the United States. And I say much to my chagrin because I had to hold down the fort. I was working 2 jobs. My dad was in New York, my younger sister, my younger brother, and myself. The other 2 older siblings were married, and they were out of the picture. After my mother came back from France, she went into the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Chabad Rebbe, in 770 for Yechidus, a private audience with the Rebbe. She went in, it was winter, it was probably Hanukkah time already, and she was wearing a heavy coat. She went in, And after standing in a long queue outside, and the Rebbe started to ask her questions about my Zayda. He was very, very interested in every little aspect of how my Zayda was managing in Paris. It's not an easy place to live. They didn't speak the language. There was no family there. There were distant cousins. And the Rebbe proceeded to ask her everything about my Zayda. And then she mentioned to him that she had built my Zayda a sukkah. And the Rebbe stood up, he put his hands on the desk, and he said, Wie azoi hat ihr das gemacht? How did you manage to achieve this remarkable task? The Rebbe knew Paris, France. He was there. He was a student at the Sorbonne. He knew they were not people-friendly. And he proceeded to ask her every single detail. And she described to him how she went and measured the space and bought the 4x4s and wrapped it in yellow plastic so it should look bright and sunny, and went to the kitchen and borrowed the knife and cut down branches after standing on a chair and nearly falling, cutting down the branches and placing it on top of the sukkah for schach, so that my Zayda could have the proper mitzvah of sitting in a sukkah on Sukkot. By this time, the Rebbe's secretary was getting very, very anxious. He kept opening the door to take my mother out because the queue outside was unbelievable. And the Rebbe kept telling him to please close the door. He wasn't finished. The Rebbe proceeded to ask every single detail about the lives of my grandparents. And when my mother explained to the Rebbe that my Zayda was no longer able to work because of the stroke, he was compromised, and only then did the Rebbe agree that my Zayda and my Bubba should move to Eretz Yisrael, which they did. My mother packed them up and off they went. But could you imagine the kibbud of aim that my mother did all those years ago for her parents, not only for her dad, but also for her mom, because her mother couldn't manage. It was impossible for her mother to manage with my Zayda. She just didn't have the stamina. She didn't have the energy. She just couldn't. And my mother packed them up, shipped everything to Kfar Chabad, and still the Rebbe inquired how she packed it, what she packed, what she was able to send across to Kfar Chabad, to Israel. My uncle was living there, and he would take care of him. But the amount of attention that the Rebbe gave my Zayda and my mother for doing what she did was unbelievable, because it meant so much to him. When it says, "Kaber es avicha ve'es imecha," respect your parents, it is such an important mitzvah that it's written in the Aseres HaDibros, in the 10 Commandments. If it's such a simple thing that, of course, we honor our parents, then why did Hashem come and write it in the Aseres HaDibros? And the way I understand it is that it's not when it's straightforward that we honor our parents. It's not when we're sitting at a simcha or at the Yom Tov table. When it's extremely hard, when our parents are not well, when our parents are frail, and then the Aseres HaDibros, Hashem comes and tells us, honor your mother and your father. And so I'd like to conclude by wishing that my mother her neshama should have an aliyah, she should have a lichtigen Gan Eden, and she should be a good beseecher for all her children and all her grandchildren and all of Klal Yisrael. May she bless every single one of us, and we all need the blessings now, with good health, with prosperity, and nachas from our children. May you all have an easy fast, a meaningful fast, and a very happy and joyous Sukkot. God bless you all. L'shana tova to all of you.